There are things in this world that know more than we do. Not people, not machines, but something older. Something that has lived close enough to the earth to feel it breathe. And if you have ever stood in the open dark, far from the noise of everything, and felt like the night was trying to tell you something, then this story already belongs to you. Her name was Maren. She was 31 years old, and she had moved back to her grandmother's farm in the valley after a year that had quietly taken everything from her. Not in one loud catastrophe. In the slow, draining way that hard years do. Our relationship ended without drama, without screaming, with only the terrible politeness of two people who no longer recognized each other. A job she had believed in for 6 years disappeared in a single email. And her grandmother, Hilda, the last person in the world who still called her by her childhood nickname, had passed in March, leaving behind an old house, 40 acres of uneven land, and a horse named Soldat whom no one had been able to explain. She had not planned to stay. She told herself it was just the summer. Just long enough to sort through the house, sell the property if she could, and figure out what came next. But the valley had a different rhythm than the city. Slower, more honest. And Soldat, the old gray gelding her grandmother had owned for nearly 12 years, had a way of making her feel watched. Not uncomfortably. More like the way an old friend watches you across a crowded room. Patient. Knowing. She noticed it on her third evening. She had gone out to the small paddock just before dusk, more out of restlessness than anything purposeful, and found Soldat standing at the eastern fence with his head lifted and his ears angled forward. Not grazing. Not resting. Just watching the long hill that rose at the far edge of the property. She stood beside him for a while, following his gaze. She saw nothing except the hill itself and the pale sky above it and a few dark shapes of trees along the ridge. Eventually she went inside. She thought nothing of it. The next evening, he was there again. Same fence. Same direction. Same quiet intensity in his body. She checked the time. It was 14 minutes past 7. She noted it without knowing why. On the third evening she checked again. 14 minutes past 7. She stood with him longer this time, pulling her jacket tighter, watching the hill while the sky changed colors behind it. Orange first. Then rose. Then a strange, muted violet that seemed to come from inside the light rather than from the sky itself. Soldat did not move. He barely seemed to breathe. And the silence that settled over the paddock was not the ordinary quiet of the countryside. It had a texture, a weight. Like a room just after someone has spoken something important and the words are still hanging in the air. She told herself she was reading into it. Grief does that. It makes the ordinary feel significant. It reaches into every neutral moment and whispers, "Look, there is a message here." But she could not stop watching him. She began to keep a notebook. Not out of habit. She had never been much for journals or records. She had always been the kind of person who processed things by moving forward rather than writing them down. But something about Soldat made her want to mark the evenings. The time. The direction he faced. Whether he made a sound. Whether he shifted his weight or stayed completely still. She filled 4 pages before the week was out. Always the same hill. Always just after 7. Always utterly still. She called her cousin Petra, who lived 2 towns over and who had been the one to first bring her to the farm when their grandmother was already too frail to travel. Petra was practical and warm and had an easy laugh that cut through almost anything. Maren told her about Soldat. About the fence and the hill and the exact time every evening. There was a pause on the phone. "Horses have routines," Petra said. "They're creatures of habit. More than dogs, even. He probably expects to be fed around that time. He gets fed at 5, Marin said. Another pause. Maybe he's watching for predators. He doesn't look frightened. He looks like he's waiting. Petra didn't have an answer for that. She changed the subject gently, asked about the house, about whether Marin had eaten properly today, about whether she needed company. Marin said she was fine. She wasn't sure that was true, but it was what she said. The following week, she walked the hill. She wanted to see what was there, to see it in daylight, from the top, to understand what it was that drew his attention every evening without fail. The climb was not steep, but it was longer than it looked from the paddock. The grass was dry and thick with the smell of summer, and there were wildflowers she didn't know the names of scattered through it, blue and yellow and very small. The trees along the ridge were old birch, their white bark peeling in long thin strips. From the top she could see the whole valley below her. The farmhouse looked small and warm in the late afternoon light, its red paint faded but still holding some color. The paddock, the barn, the narrow road that wound down toward town. And beyond the ridge, on the other side, a second valley, shallower and wider, with an abandoned track cutting through it in the ruins of what might once have been a stone building, its walls collapsed now into a low irregular shape in the long grass. She stood there for a long time. She didn't know what she had expected to find. Something visible, maybe. An explanation. A fence, a trail, a sign of something that would make the horse's attention make sense. But there was only the landscape. Beautiful and still and completely indifferent. She went home as the sun lowered. She got there just before 7. And Soldat was already at the fence. She stood with him that evening without trying to interpret anything. She was tired from the walk and her boots were damp, and she was thinking about her grandmother. About Hilda's hands, specifically. The way they had looked in the last years. Thin and very sure. The hands of someone who had touched the earth and animals her entire life and been made precise by it. She had always said that animals told you the truth. Not in words. In behavior. In what they turned toward and what they turned away from. Marin heard her grandmother's voice very clearly in that moment. Not dramatically. Not as something supernatural. Just the quiet memory of a voice that had been important. She heard it the way you sometimes hear music while washing dishes. Without knowing why it has surfaced. The animals tell you the truth, Marin. They always have. We just stopped knowing how to listen. The sky was nearly dark. And that was when Soldat shifted. Not backward. Forward. One step, then another, pressing gently against the fence, his great head lifting slightly as if testing the air. His ears had gone fully forward now, both of them, precise as antennas. And a sound came from him. Not a whinny. Something lower. A soft, rolling exhalation of breath through his nostrils that carried something she couldn't quite name. Recognition, maybe. Or the feeling just before recognition. She looked up at the hill. In the deep blue of the near dark, against the pale sky still holding its last light above the ridge, she could see a shape. A person. Standing at the top of the hill, very still, the way Soldat was still. Just watching. Her heart did something strange. Not fear exactly. More like the feeling of a door opening that you had forgotten was there. She waited. The figure didn't move. She couldn't tell if it was a man or a woman. Only that it was someone. Someone standing on the hill at the same time Soldat came to the fence every evening. She thought about going inside. She thought about calling Petra. She thought about a dozen practical and sensible things. Then she opened the paddock gate. She did not take a lead rope. She did not put on a halter. She simply walked in, and Soldat turned toward her, and she put one hand on his neck, and they stood together for a moment in the darkening paddock. He was warm. The kind of warmth that animals carry that feels deeper than temperature. Like heat from a stone that has been in the sun all day. She felt her own heartbeat slow. "All right," she said quietly. She didn't know exactly who she was saying it to. She walked toward the hill. Soldat stayed at her side without being led, matching her pace with a naturalness that felt like something she had always known how to do but hadn't done in a long time. His hooves were quiet in the thick grass. The field had that smell it gets in late evening, something loamy and alive and slightly sweet, and the first stars were beginning to show above the ridge, faint and then firmer as her eyes adjusted. The shape on the hill was still there. It hadn't moved. But it wasn't watching her approach the way you watch a stranger. It was more like standing still the way you stand still when someone has finally arrived. The climb felt different in the dark. The same grass, the same flowers she now couldn't see, the same birch trees rustling very lightly at the top. But everything felt more immediate, more present, like the night was slightly closer than the day, pressing in softly at the edges. When she reached the top, she saw that it was a man. Old. Not her grandmother's age old, but past middle age certainly. He had white hair cut short in a face that had spent a great deal of its life outdoors, the lines in it deep and earned. He wore a dark coat and his hands were in his pockets, and he was looking at her with an expression that was somehow both surprised and completely unsurprised. He looked at Soldat for a long moment before he looked at her again. "He's still here," the man said. His voice was quiet, unhurried. "He's been here for 12 years, Marin said. The man nodded slowly. He seemed to be measuring something. Not her, exactly. Something in the situation. In the fact of the horse standing calm at her side at the top of a hill in the dark. "My name is Einar," he said. "I used to live in the valley. The other side of this ridge." He tilted his head in the direction of the ruins she had seen that afternoon. "I left 30 years ago. My wife and I. We had to. The house fell." He paused. "I mean the building. But also everything else." She didn't say she was sorry. It didn't seem like the right response. Instead she said, "I'm Marin. This was my grandmother's farm. She passed in March." He looked down at the farmhouse below. From up here it was just its lights now, warm and small in the dark of the valley. "Hilda," he said. Not a question. "You knew her." "For 50 years." He was quiet a moment. "She never told me when she was sick. I found out from someone in town, weeks after. I've been coming up here ever since. I don't entirely know why." He looked at Soldat again. "But I think he does." Marin thought about that. About the notebook she had been keeping. About 14 minutes past 7, every evening, all summer. About her grandmother's hands and her grandmother's voice. About the way grief makes the world feel like it is trying to say something, and how most of the time you can't quite hear it. "He comes to this fence every evening at the same time," she said. "I've been following him in my head for 2 weeks. Tonight was the first time I followed him in person." Einar looked at the horse with an expression she couldn't fully name. Something gentle and tired and honest. "He used to come to this ridge when Hilda and I would talk," he said. "When she was young and I was young, and the valley felt like it held everything we would ever need. He wasn't this horse, of course. There were other horses before him. But there has always been a horse at that fence. Every time we ever stood here." The night was fully dark now. Not completely silent. There was wind in the birch trees and something small moving in the grass far below, and the faint, distant sound of the road. But up here it felt contained. Like the ridge held the air differently than the valley. Marin looked at Soldat. He was standing at the top of the hill looking out over the second valley, his gray coat almost silver in the starlight, his posture utterly at peace. Not watching for anything anymore. Just present. Just here. I think she asked him to watch for you, Maren said. She hadn't planned to say it. It came out of somewhere she wasn't entirely supervising. Einar didn't laugh. He didn't look at her strangely. He only nodded, slowly, the way people nod when something has put words to something they already knew. They stood there together, the three of them, for a long time. The man who had loved her grandmother for 50 years. The granddaughter who had come back to the valley at the end of a long year to try to figure out what came next. And the horse who had been standing at the same fence, at the same time, every evening. Waiting for exactly this. The following weeks had a different quality than the ones before them. Not easier, exactly. Grief is not a thing that lessons dismantle. But different. More permeable somehow. More open. Einar came most evenings. Sometimes they met on the hill and sometimes they sat on the low stone wall at the edge of the paddock, and he would talk about Hilda the way people talk about someone when they have known them for so long that the memories aren't separate stories anymore but a continuous living thing. He told her about the summer her grandmother had taught herself to repair the roof and fallen through it and laughed so hard from the floor below that the neighbors heard her. He told her about how Hilda used to feed the horses from her coat pocket and how every horse she ever had learned the sound of that particular coat. He told her about conversations that had lasted hours and arguments that had lasted years in a friendship that had survived both. Maren listened. She wrote some of it down later, in the same notebook where she had tracked Soldat's evenings. She wasn't sure why she felt compelled to preserve it. She just knew that some things deserved to be written. Not for any audience. Just so they exist in a more permanent form than memory. She began to repair the house. Not because she had decided to stay, but because the house needed it and she was there, and she was beginning to understand that some decisions are made slowly, from the outside in, rather than in one clear moment. She fixed a window in the spare room first. Then the gate that had been sticking. Then she dug out the small kitchen garden that her grandmother had let go in her last years and turned the soil and planted late-season vegetables she wasn't sure would make it before the frost. Soldat watched all of this with great equanimity. He followed her along the fence line when she moved around the property. He pressed his large hand into her shoulder when she stood still long enough. He was not a demonstrative animal in the way some horses are. He was more like a presence. Something that made the silence feel inhabited rather than empty. She stopped thinking of him as something strange. Whatever he had been doing at that fence every evening, whatever combination of animal sense and long habit and something she still didn't have a word for had drawn him there, it had led her somewhere she needed to go. That was enough. She didn't need to explain it further than that. One afternoon in early September, she found a box in the back of the bedroom wardrobe. It was not large. A shoebox, actually, wrapped in brown paper and tied with kitchen string, the kind her grandmother had kept in a drawer near the stove. Inside were letters. Not many. 30, perhaps. Written in a hand she didn't recognize. The postmarks were old, some of them from 40 years ago, some more recent. She recognized the town they came from. It was where Einar had said he had moved with his wife. She sat on the edge of the bed for a while. She didn't read them. They were not hers to read. But she held the box in her lap for a long time, thinking about 50 years of friendship, about letters carried back and forth across the valley and the ridge, about all the ways people keep their connections alive across distance and change and loss and time. That evening she brought the box to the hill. She didn't call ahead. She just climbed as the light was fading and found Einar already at the top, his hands in his coat pockets, looking at the valley below with the expression he often had up here. Quiet and full. She held out the box without speaking. He looked at it for a long moment before he took it. He untied the string carefully, the way you handle something old. He lifted the lid and looked inside, and something moved across his face that she felt she shouldn't watch too closely. She looked out at the valley instead. At the farmhouse. At the ribbon of the road. At the pale ghost of the moon beginning to appear above the far hills. She heard him breathe. A long, slow breath. Like something setting down a weight. She kept them, he said. She kept everything that mattered, Maren said. He closed the box. He held it the way you hold something you didn't expect to be given back. She was the best person I ever knew, he said. And I told her that. Plenty of times. But I didn't always show it. There were years we barely spoke. Because of pride, mostly. Because of the particular stubbornness of people who love each other and refuse to say so. Maren nodded. She thought of her own year. Of the relationship that had ended with politeness because neither of them had learned how to be honest before it was too late. Of the job she had believed in without ever asking whether it believed in her. I think she knew, she said. I think so too. He looked at the box again. But I'm glad she kept these. They stood until the last light left the sky. Soldat was at the fence below. She could see him from up here, a gray shape in the dark of the paddock, perfectly still. She thought about her grandmother choosing that horse. About 12 years of evenings at the same fence. About the particular intelligence of animals who spend their lives close to people and learn the patterns of human walking the way they learn the patterns of weather. She thought, you chose him well, Grandma. And she thought, I might stay. Not decided. Not certain. But something in her had shifted, the way a heavy piece of furniture shifts when someone finally helps you move it. Just a few inches. Just enough that the room feels different. Just enough that she could see the place where it had always been meant to go. And if you are still here, still listening in the quiet of wherever you are tonight, then maybe this is the kind of story that finds the people who need it. You can stay a little longer with us. You can like the video, or simply keep listening. We are glad you are here. Autumn came to the valley with a slowness that felt deliberate. The light changed first. It came in at a lower angle, softer and more golden, and it made everything it touched look slightly more beautiful than it actually was. Then the mornings began to cool. Then the birch trees on the ridge went yellow and the sound the wind made in them changed from summer's dry rustle to something rounder and more complex. Maren found a winter coat in the wardrobe. It was not hers. It was her grandmother's, a dark green wool coat with large pockets and a collar that folded up against the neck. She put it on one morning without thinking much about it and wore it out to the paddock and immediately felt Soldat's attention shift. He came to her. Not with any urgency. Just steadily, directly, his great head reaching out and pressing into her shoulder in a way that was different from the usual. More deliberate. She understood then what Einar had said about the horses always learning the coat. About her grandmother feeding them from the pockets. About the particular language animals build with the people they live alongside. She stood very still and let him press his head against her and breathed the cold morning air and felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Not happiness exactly. Something quieter and more durable than happiness. Something that had to do with continuity. With being a link in something longer than your own life. Einar brought her a pot of soup in October, showing up unannounced on a Tuesday afternoon with a container wrapped in a dish towel and a matter-of-fact expression that made her feel that this was simply what neighbors did and she should not make too much of it. They ate at the kitchen table and he told her about the valley in winter. About the way the snow came and changed its proportions entirely, making the hills look smaller and the distance between things feel greater. About how her grandmother had always kept the kitchen window clear so she could see the paddock from the stove, no matter the weather. Maren looked at the window. at the clear view it offered of the paddock and the fence and the far hill beyond. She thought about all the mornings her grandmother had stood at this stove and looked out at that view. About how many of those mornings Soldat had been visible at that fence. About whether Hilda had understood what he was watching for, or whether she had simply known him well enough to trust what he was doing. She thought she knew. She always knew. The decision happened quietly one morning in November. She was standing in the garden pulling up the last of the season's vegetables, most of them better than she had expected given how late she had planted, and she realized she had stopped thinking of the valley as temporary. She hadn't noticed when it happened. It had happened the way important changes often do. Not in a single moment, but through the accumulation of small ones. Through enough evenings on the hill and enough mornings in the coat and enough conversations at the kitchen table that the place had simply become the context within which her life was taking place. She called Petra that evening. She said she was staying. Petra laughed, the easy warm laugh that cut through everything. "I know," she said. "I've known since July." Marin asked her how. "Because you stopped talking about what you were going to do next," Petra said. "You only do that when you're already doing it." Marin found a photograph in the second week of November. She had been sorting through a box of papers in the study, not with any goal in mind, just the slow work of understanding what she had inherited, and the photograph was tucked inside a book of poetry, the kind of placement that felt intentional rather than accidental. A bookmark in reverse, marking the hiding place, not the page. It was a photograph of two young people on a hillside. She recognized the hill immediately. The same ridge she climbed every evening. The same birch trees, smaller in the photograph but already clearly themselves. The young woman in the photograph had her face turned toward the camera, laughing at something just outside the frame, and Marin had to look for a long time before she saw her grandmother in her. The bones of the face were there, the angle of the jaw. But Hilda in the photograph was perhaps 22, and there was a lightness in her posture that Marin had never known. The young man beside her was looking at Hilda rather than at the camera, and even in the stillness of the old image, even through 60 years of color fade and paper grain, what he felt was entirely visible. She turned the photograph over. Her grandmother's handwriting on the back. Not a date. Not a name. Just 4 words. The best summer. Always. Marin sat with the photograph for a long time. She thought about the man she had met on the hill, white-haired now and careful in his movements, with that expression that carried so much weight and wore it quietly. She thought about 60 years. About what it meant to look at a person with that kind of feeling in your eyes and then carry it, intact, for 60 years through a life that led elsewhere. Through a wife and a daughter in a house that fell in a different valley in a long absence. She thought, love is not what we think it is when we are young. It is not only the bright part. It is also what you carry forward. What you do not put down. She placed the photograph on the mantelpiece. She didn't know if Einar would see it next time he came. But she thought it should not stay hidden in a book in a box. She thought some things deserved to be out in the light. She stood at the kitchen window while she talked and watched the paddock in the last of the day's light and saw Soldat at the eastern fence, still and attentive, facing the hill. She went out after she hung up. She walked to the fence and stood beside him. The hill was dark now. She looked up toward the ridge and saw nothing. Just the hill and the sky and the first stars. "He's not coming tonight," she said to the horse. Einar had told her last week that he was going to visit his daughter for a few weeks. She hadn't told Soldat. Horses don't need to be told things in words. But she sent it anyway. Soldat remained at the fence. His ears were still forward. He was still looking toward the ridge with that focused, settled attention. She watched him for a while. Then she looked up at the hill herself. And she thought about her grandmother, who had stood in this paddock for decades, who had kept letters in a shoebox tied with kitchen string, who had chosen a gray horse and named him Soldat and let him develop habits no one could fully explain, who had, without ever saying so in so many words, set something in motion. The wind moved through the grass. The stars sharpened. Somewhere distant, too far to locate, a bird called once and went quiet. And Soldat made that sound again. The low, soft exhalation. Not a whinny. Not a call. Something older than either. Something that seemed to say, yes. Here. This is where we are supposed to be. Maren put her hand on his neck. He was warm. He was here. And so was she. She didn't go inside for a long time. She stayed at the fence with the horse in the dark, looking up at the hill that had been watching over this valley for longer than any of them, and she felt, without drama, without ceremony, the specific and irreplaceable feeling of being exactly where you belong. Not because the year hadn't been hard. Because it had. Not because grief had finished. Because it hadn't. But because sometimes the things that break you open also break you open toward something. Toward a place. Toward a person. Toward a long gray horse at a fence who stood every evening at the same hour, faithful and patient and entirely certain, waiting for whoever needed to be led to the top of the hill to see what was there. She thought of her grandmother one more time before she went inside. She thought of Hilda's hands and Hilda's voice in the green coat now hanging on the hook by the door. She thought of 50 years of letters carried over a ridge. She thought of all the things her grandmother had tended without explanation and trusted without proof. And she said, very quietly, just to the dark and the wind and the warm weight of the horse beside her, I understand now. The stars were very clear. The valley was very still. And somewhere above the ridge, the night had the particular quality it sometimes carries in the mountains, wide and deep and full of something just beyond the reach of language. She went inside. She made tea. She stood at the kitchen window and looked at the paddock, at Soldat, who had finally left the fence and was moving slowly toward the barn. She watched him until he disappeared into the shadow of the barn door, then kept watching even after he was gone, the way you keep looking at a doorway after someone has walked through it. There was a particular quality to the farmhouse at night that she had not expected when she first arrived. She had expected loneliness. She had expected the special weight that empty houses carry, the weight of all the living that used to happen in them and no longer did. And it was there sometimes. She wouldn't pretend otherwise. On certain evenings, especially early on, she would walk through a room and feel her grandmother's absence the way you feel a missing step in the dark. A sudden lurch. A reaching for something solid that isn't there. But the house was not empty, exactly. It was full of what Hilda had left. Not just the objects. Not just the coat on the hook or the letters in the wardrobe or the dried herbs that still hung in the kitchen from the previous summer. It was the quality of attention the house seemed to hold. The way the kitchen window was positioned precisely to see the paddock. The way the reading chair had been placed at an angle that caught the morning light. Small decisions made over decades by a woman who had known what she was doing. A woman who had thought carefully about where things belonged and arranged the world around her accordingly. Maren began to understand that living in someone else's house, really living in it rather than passing through, was a form of conversation. You learned their habits by inheriting them. You learned what mattered to them by discovering what they had been careful with. Her grandmother had been careful with light, with warmth, with the view from every window. These were not accidents. They were intentions. A kind of written record left in wood and stone and glass for anyone willing to read it slowly enough. She read it slowly. She had nowhere to rush. She picked up the notebook. She turned to a fresh page. And she began to write. Not about the horse, this time. About the valley. About the hill. About the man with white hair who had known her grandmother for half a century and had stood at the top of the ridge every evening with his hands in his pockets, hoping for nothing more than the presence of the familiar. She wrote for a long time. The tea went cold. The kitchen grew warm from the stove. Outside, the night deepened over the valley and the hill and the ridge, and the lights of the farmhouse sat small and steady in the dark, the way lights do when they belong to a place that is truly someone's home. This is the story of a horse who knew something a woman needed to learn, and of a grandmother who, without a single word, arranged for her to learn it. And of all the ordinary and extraordinary things that pass between the people and the animals and the places that love us, even after we think the loving is finished. It is never finished. It only changes form. It becomes a coat on a hook, a box of letters tied with string, a gray horse at a fence at 14 minutes past 7 every evening, without fail, pointing toward the hill, waiting for you to follow. If this story found you tonight and stayed with you in some quiet way, you can leave a like below or share a thought if something moved you. And if you'd like to return to stories like this one, slow and cinematic and told for the hours when the world needs to be a little smaller and a little warmer, you can join us by subscribing. We'll be here, telling the next one, waiting, just like Soledad, for you to find your way back.